there's no obvious mathematical reason that it should spit out something that looks kind of like playing poker well, but it turns out it did. And we just ran with that. We're like, okay, we can run this with multiple players, and it spits out something that looks kind of like playing poker well. And we're going to build out these massive libraries of preflop solutions, and we're going to memorize them, and we're going to play like that. And I that's what I've done too, and I think it is a good approach to getting better. But it's really not clear what we're doing here.
So I asked you in April of 2023 about winning poker tournaments, about how much it means to you. And you were, unbeknownst to you, only in the early to middle stages of a heater that was not just a heater, it was a lot of wins. There weren't like a lot of second through fourth places there. And you said, previous to at that point, I think you'd won maybe 4 tournaments, at least 3 in the past 4 or 5 months at that point.
Yeah.
And you said, up until that point, you were kind of the guy who almost infamously was never winning tournaments relative to your results as someone who was winning in poker and known as a high stakes crusher. Not your words, but you just weren't the guy who was winning, and then you just won tournament after tournament in 2023. But at the same time, I have another conversation that we had where I asked you about winning poker tournaments, and it felt a little downplayed relative to what other people have told me about their feelings about winning. You made a comment that I found really interesting that stuck with me. You said winning poker tournaments isn't really the point, it's almost incidental. Can you talk a little bit about that and about what it was like to win so many tournaments last year?
It's kind of funny because, like, obviously, it feels like it's the point. You're supposed to try to win the tournament, and it is hugely important to your bottom line in the short and long run. There's a huge difference between getting first versus second versus third. That really can make or break a year or a period of several years. That you know, 30 buy-in difference or whatever sometimes. But at the same time, it's actually not even the thing you're optimizing for a lot of the time while you're playing. Like, when you're playing a final table, the play that makes you most likely to win the tournament and the correct play are very, very often not the same thing. The play that maximizes EV is not the play that makes you most likely to win the tournament. It's the play that makes you least likely to bust this hand, most likely to ladder a few spots. So I think it's like actually kind of important to not really think of winning the tournament as the goal, because so often you're not actually making the play that optimizes for that. And if even like kind of emotionally in the back of your mind, you are overly fixated on wanting to get first place, it interferes in making the best decisions that you can. So, like, it really does feel incidental, I think is kind of the right word, that like it wasn't exactly what I was trying to do when I showed up to play this final table, is win the
Mhm.
tournament. I was trying to make the highest EV play every time it was my turn, and it worked out that I won the tournament, and that's great. It's the best possible outcome, but it's not what I was thinking about until I was heads up. It was often at odds with my actual goal, which is to make as much money as possible.
I hope this soundbite gets Twitter enraged. I hope the internet loses their shit and puts Ike up on a crucifix. How dare he? I can picture it. I can picture this
I hope
some
so.
poker news
I'll go down with
headline with,
that ship.
yeah, I want to see Helmuth pen an article. I want to see all the big names come out. Like Haxton, heretical against tournaments. Guy's not even trying to win. So part two, what was it like with all the incidental wins? I mean, you just shipped tournament after tournament, and I mean, we talked earlier about how it can get funny with 5 bullets in a tournament. Was it getting funny with how many trophies you were hoisting?
Oh, absolutely. It was funny. It obviously it was a lot of fun. I certainly enjoy winning a tournament. I do like to make money, and I was making a lot of money very quickly during that stretch, which is always nice. And yeah, it was just like variance messes with your head no matter how long you've been doing this, no matter whether it's positive or negative variance. You hear people talk all the time about being on a downswing and getting it in ahead and just feeling like they know they're going to lose and then they do lose. And it's this recurring thing that you almost start to feel like you are manifesting bad outcomes and like maybe you need to get your mindset right and start believing in yourself again so you can win all ins and all of this absurd stuff that goes through your head when you just can't seem to win. And it was really the first time in my career that I had had the reverse of that in tournaments where like I don't know, I think the first moment it occurred to me was pretty early in the run. I was chip leader at the final table, final table, but also stole the bubble, I think, because it was a tournament that paid 7 or 8, 6 or 7 spots or something like that. Final 100K in Bahamas, and I shove small to big with 10-2 off, get called by Adrian, who has ace king, and I'm just like, "Well, I've just won every time I've been all in for the last month straight. I just kinda feel like I'm gonna win again," and, just flop a pair and hold, and I'm just, like, kinda giggling the whole time. I'm like, "I just fucking knew that was gonna happen." I think I, like, accidentally said something that was slightly rude, and I think Adrian took it well, but yeah, that kind of just it was a year-long period where I just kind of felt like every time I got all in, I was probably gonna win because it just kept happening, and that kind of thing becomes self-reinforcing in your head even if you know it's nonsense. And it can be
It's
fun to, like, lean into it a little and play it up even more than it is, just kinda troll people and entertain yourself.
it's funny you mentioned Adrian. He was at my table, and it was a big one. Was it the 250? I can't remember. I don't want to say the wrong thing. If it wasn't the 250, it was. I think it was the 250,
Yeah,
relatively early, but maybe it was a high roller, whatever.
yeah,
Actually, it wasn't because it was the bubble. 50K, let's say,
sure.
and yeah, it was the 50K. He 50K WSOP, and he got in jacks versus queens for a ton, or maybe it was queens versus kings, but one
Yeah,
under pair, and it was the exact bubble. And he like they go to turn their cards over, and he sees, he goes, ah, and they make him turn it back over because it's the bubble and we're waiting or
right.
whatnot. And then everyone makes a joke because Adrian's running incredible right now. 2024, he's just absolutely killed it. And like we just look at him, we're like, are you seriously doubting? He goes, oh gosh. And he just kind of like reminds us, of course I'm fine. Of course. No, no issue, no issue. And you can see, I can't remember who it was, but it was a reg with the overpair. He was sweating. He was just like, and then yeah, he just Adrian drills it on the flop. We're all laughing. We can't contain ourselves. The other guy handled it pretty well, but it was just absurd. And it was exactly the situation with your 10-2, where it's just,
Exactly.
when it's your time, it's your time. And yeah, I think I felt that to a lesser degree before.
A
Not
couple hours
quite where I
previous in
feel.
that same tournament, Adrian had busted me ace queen against ace queen, and the same thing is that everyone is laughing, like, as soon as one card of his suit is on the flop, everyone is laughing more, and then sure enough, the flush runs out, and everyone's just like, "Yeah, of course that was gonna happen."
Variance is just so much sillier than, yeah, than anyone really wants to admit to
Oh,
themselves.
yeah.
It's, yeah, that's wild. So, bullet point, the breaking news from GTO Lab podcast: Ike Haxton enjoyed winning the tournaments. It was a fun time.
Oh, yeah.
All right, strategy corner. A conversation, maybe not a conversation, a phrase I hear pretty frequently among high stakes tournament players that I don't seem to hear in the mid stakes and certainly not in low stakes is discussing the shape of a spot, not discussing necessarily all the specifics of the range, but what it means to understand the shape of a situation.
Mhm.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of the thing we've come back to a bunch of times in this discussion of understanding what's important about a spot and understanding the broad guiding principles that will keep you from making big mistakes. So when you're talking about the shape of a spot, the first layer of that would be like sizes and frequencies. Like a very straightforward shape would be this is a 100% C bet for quarter pot spot, or this is a some big bets and some checks spot. And when you say this is a some big bets and some checks spot, like, maybe that's 60% B70, 40% check is the precise answer, but a bit more check betting than checking and a size bigger than half pot is sufficient that you're not costing yourself anything. And you get the
Mhm.
shape of the spot right, you're doing well. And that's more important than, like, you can have the spot totally wrong and make the right play, where, like, you can think it's a spot where you're supposed to bet small and high frequency, but you happen to check your hand, and then you made a good play, but you totally misunderstood the shape of the spot. Um, and then,
I've
like,
always
sorry, what's that?
I was gonna say I've always felt like I have a good understanding of how poker works
Yeah.
and the logic of situations, but as someone who's not as well studied as his peers, I just don't know the shape of as many spots.
Mhm.
If you give me the shape, I feel like I can fill it in relatively well and
Right.
put the logic together. And I feel like learning the shape of the spot is something that's super important that
Yeah.
a lot of players don't know in so many spots, including the ones that you talked about that come up very frequently. Like, hey, this is just cut off first big blind for chip EV, and these boards come up super frequently. And if you don't understand the shape of that spot, like you said, you could come up with the right answer, but consistently, it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, and you get to like a river spot, and now talking about the shape of the spot gets there's like a lot more to that. Like, what are the minimum value thresholds? Like, what's the weakest hand you can bet for value, and for what size? Is it the sort of spot where if your hand is worth 0 as a check, you always bluff it, or do you surrender some of your hands that are worth 0? Like, that's a kind of characteristic of the shape of a spot that I
Mhm.
think can be super important, but only relatively advanced players, are necessarily thinking about that, or yeah, like, finding not just, your minimum value, but, like, the maximum hand that is still always a bluff, or, like, where do the check raises come from in your range? What properties does a hand need to have to consider check raising rather than always betting for value? Yeah, describing the shape of a river spot can get quite complicated.
Makes sense. And it builds on the previous streets
Yeah,
without an understanding of them. You just kind of drawing dead, except for getting lucky every once in a while.
yeah.
Do you think consideration should be given to the decisions a player makes in big pots, in big spots, when assessing the skill of a player? Do you think that's kind of purely variance and you look at all the other metrics, how sharp they are, how well they play against recreationals, whatever, measurements you might give? Or do you think there is something to some people in big spots seem to consistently make better decisions than other people?
I think there's something to it. I think it's an easy thing to overrate because, it's necessarily going to be a pretty small sample size, and it's not that hard to just go on a run where you guess right or wrong in several big spots in a row. And I do think, it can get exaggerated where, certain players are thought of as executing really well or relatively poorly in the most important moments. But for sure, it's a real thing. And I think you see it pretty often with people who are relatively new to high stakes, that they execute less well at a final table of a very high stakes tournament under a lot of pressure. Uh, Yeah, I think that matters. I think executing well under pressure is a big deal, and a lot goes into that. Like, it might not be that, at the final table, you just panic and do something awful. It can be relatively subtle stuff, like you're playing a 3-day tournament with long days at the end of a long trip, and you're already fatigued, and you make this huge final table, and now you're stressed out and you don't sleep well the night before it, and now you're, like, really fatigued at the final table playing for the most money you've ever played for in your life, and you're just a little less sharp. And I think that kind of dealing with pressure is maybe a bigger deal than the, like, kind of flashier, um, guessing right in the big moment sort of thing. The just, yeah, being able to bring your A game, or at least your B plus game, very consistently through emotionally and physically exhausting long hours, culminating in you play the highest stakes at the very end. And just, yeah, staying sharp and in the moment and ready to execute. I think that's a thing that people who are newer to high stakes can struggle with.
When you say that and you mentioned the fatigue, something that may not in actuality be adjacent, but in my head kind of comes up as adjacent to that is some people in those really big spots, they just seem to wear it on them that they really don't want to punt. And it helps you understand their pre-flop range 3% more. And then by the time you get to the river, you understand their river range 25% more. And that's a very, very costly thing that all comes from kind of a reasonable route, which is I don't want to make a colossal mistake.
Right.
But if you don't make colossal mistakes in poker over a long run, I don't see how you could be playing well.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think is a more subtle sort of, you know, clutch, if you want to use that word, rising to the occasion in the highest pressure moments. Willingness to pull the trigger on something where you might look foolish if you're wrong, or you're going for a play that's usually not gonna work, but you're getting the right price.
Mhm.
Being willing to, just execute and do the thing you're supposed to do, even though it feels like it has an emotionally bad distribution of outcomes where you're just gonna feel shitty about it a large percentage of the time after it happens. There's, yeah, all kinds of psychological tricks that get in your way of being able to do that in high pressure moments, especially if you're less experienced and less confident. Um, when it feels like this is your one shot at the biggest score of your life, you don't want to go out in sixth, just calling off for slightly the right price or whatever. But you don't maximize your EV if you don't.
Yeah, that's one of the first hurdles. I mean, there's so many of these psychological hurdles to playing great poker is just not harmonized with a normal human experience. And one of them is if you're a relatively successful person in life, you probably don't say, this is going to be correct 38%. Let's go ahead and risk my life on it. That
Yeah.
seems fantastic. And that's just such a common occurrence at the
Oh
poker
yeah, all
table.
the time.
Yeah. And so many people, you can just kind of read it on them where they're like, please give me a flip. Just let me bust with an all in pre-flop, preferably with a slight advantage in my direction.
Yeah,
And
or
they
at
get their
least a good
wish
enough
for
hand that I
nine big
don't have to
blinds.
second guess it.
Exactly. You ever heard of Chuck Klosterman?
I have definitely heard the name. I am blanking on the association.
I think he has his own podcast too, but sharp guy. I've always enjoyed his stuff all over the place, sports, music, movies. But one of his books that was an interesting take was called "But What If We're Wrong," and the whole
Mhm.
book was taking things we would never in a million years think we're wrong about, but maybe like one of them and or something. There's something today. His premise is that there's something today we all take for granted that we're just going to be dead wrong about, hundreds of years from now.
For
That
sure, yeah.
just is kind of how everything tends to work over the course of history. So he takes a shot at some, and it's all, I don't know about satirical, but like taking his best shot at we just completely misunderstand gravity, or we're not the
Hmm,
smartest species on the planet, or something like that.
mhm.
And it's, everything he writes is part humor. But my question is, what if we're wrong with regards to poker? Curious if you can take a shot at something that you almost certainly don't think we're wrong about, but there's a possibility we have completely off.
That's a good one. So there's a lot of stuff that, like, it just seems rather likely that we're wrong about. So I wouldn't count those. Like, ICM is just, it's not correct. It is pretty good. We don't really have anything better, but like everyone knows ICM is not the answer. So like that's sort of the easy one, but I feel like it's not even in the spirit of the question because so obviously, like, yeah, that will eventually be improved upon. Um,
That was my answer. Guess it is too
to a
obvious.
to a lesser extent, I think it's almost even obvious that this is wrong too, but maybe a lot of people don't agree. All of our multiplayer preflop solves are a little bit magical and might be wronger than people anticipate. Um, this is a little bit of like a pet gripe of mine because I feel like no one really understands or appreciates it very well. But we have these massive libraries of 6 or 8-handed preflop outputs that people generated in Monker or whatever that are, what you go look up in GTO Wizard or whatever your favorite poker software is. And it's really not very obvious what those are. Like, for heads up, we're pretty certain we have the answers. You can calculate the exploitability of a heads up strategy. You run PO solver for heads up no limit starting from preflop, and then you can lock the button strategy and find the max exploit big blind strategy, and you have an exploitability number. You know the distance that your solution is from a true Nash equilibrium, and the algorithm provably converges toward the Nash equilibrium. The longer you run it, the smaller that exploitability gets. As soon as you add in a third player, that's not true anymore. You're using the same algorithm, and it doesn't provably do anything in particular. It was a surprise when people took counterfactual regret minimization, the algorithm that underpins, every solver that people use, and ran it with more than 2 players, and it spit out something that wasn't complete nonsense. There's no obvious mathematical reason that it should spit out something that looks kind of like playing poker well, but it turns out it did. And we just ran with that. We're like, okay, we can run this with multiple players, and it spits out something that looks kind of like playing poker well. And we're going to build out these massive libraries of preflop solutions, and we're going to memorize them, and we're going to play like that. And I that's what I've done too. And I think it is a good approach to getting better, but it's really not clear what we're doing here.
Nobody
Uh,
thought CFR would work for multi-way, and it just did, or seemingly did.
yeah, I mean, it only provably works for 2 players. You you can't compute an exploitability for 3 players.
Hmm.
Um, like, it's not even clear what that would mean. Do you hold one strategy fixed and let the other 2 players collude to beat the fixed strategy for as much as possible, that doesn't really seem like the answer. But,
Yeah.
like, literally, it doesn't mean anything. There's not an obvious concept for the word exploitability to correspond to. It's not just that you can't calculate, you can't even define it. Um, so we have these outputs that are just kind of magic, and they seem really good. They really do. But, like, that would be my what if we're wrong, is like maybe they're
Yeah.
really categorically wrong. Maybe there is a way of thinking about this question that makes more sense than the way we've been thinking about it so far, and no one has articulated it yet, as far as I know. And there could be a real leap forward in our understanding of multiplayer poker. Um, and it's anyone's guess what that would look like. I mean, I couldn't begin to tell you, like, oh, the button is going to open looser in the future when we know how it works. Like, I have no idea. It might even be more like at some point in the future, we come to appreciate just how broken multiplayer poker is, in the sense that, like, any two of the three players in a three-handed game can kind of subtly deviate to crush the third one. That, like, the game is really, really inherently collusive in a way that we have not fully appreciated so far. And that actually does functionally matter in terms of what the best way to play is, in a way that we really underestimate so far. Of course, we understand that if two players, like, full on collude, like, share cards, or you don't even have to share cards. You can just have some kind of implicit agreement to play in a way that is mutually favorable. Tit for tat, across different scenarios. That could end up being a bigger deal than we appreciate, and I mean, who knows? It is very uncharted territory. But yeah, the math of, like, optimal play with more than two players is, like, just very poorly understood at this point, I think.
When you bring up tit for tat, you're referencing the prisoner's dilemma strategy of cooperate until you've been sabotaged and then sabotage until they cooperate again.
Um, a bit more broadly than that, just sort of generically, I'll do something that costs me a small amount and benefits you a large amount right now, and you'll do the same for me later.
Okay. Quid pro
Like,
quo.
yeah, yeah. For
So this is
example, in a three-handed game where you're the button and I'm the big blind, you fold all of your lowest EV opens, and now I get to play big blind in position against small blind much, much more often, and I'm gaining more than you're losing. And then I do the same for you on my button. And, like, just this agreement is enough that, like, in a three-handed game between three great players, now the two of us are crushing that third player.
mhm.
Uh, that this is some deep lore in online poker history, but there was, like, a big collusion scandal in it was like 5 BB push fold 501k on 888 like 15 years ago. Um, this game was running three-handed a lot, and there were two players in the game who were colluding in essentially just this manner. They may have been communicating about their whole cards on top of it,
Mm.
such that they were especially doing this like when the big blind had a good hand. Um, which, obviously is another level of it. But like even without the communication on a hand by hand basis, just doing that is enough to have like a pretty big edge in a game like that.
So when you bring it up, how just multi-way might be naturally more collusive than we think, my initial thought was like, okay, Texas Hold'em could be a little bit more Settlers of Catan or Risk, like,
Yeah.
where playing well pushes you into that realm. Are you worried about people who are not trying to be bad actors basically subconsciously adopting some of this, or just worried about how open it is for bad actors to subtly cheat or collude, however you want?
Um I don't in practice feel very worried that this is making a big difference in the games today. Like
Sure.
it's all pretty subtle and very small magnitude stuff, so long as you're not doing anything extreme. Um, but you look at all of these preflop outputs, and there are mixed strategies everywhere, including mixed between fold and VPIP. So, like,
Mhm.
definitionally, it is worth 0 to you whether you fold or put money in the pot. And your decision to do that is not worth 0 to everyone else at the table. You have an opportunity to arbitrarily move some EV around between the other seats around you. And yeah, like I was saying, it's small amounts and like absurdly hard to execute in an organized way, even if you were trying to, as long as you're not like, openly and directly colluding with somebody. But it points toward our sense of what an equilibrium is in a multiplayer game being pretty incomplete. Um, and yeah, I'm more thinking of it just from a theoretical standpoint of like I have to wonder if there's some framework that we haven't stumbled on just yet for thinking more clearly about how that stuff works, because that that's such a difference as opposed to the same situation heads up where like you have a hand that is mixed folder raise first in from the button heads up, then it doesn't matter on a one-off basis if you hold it or not, but you have to play it some of the time in order to remain balanced and not be counter exploited. Whereas, yeah, you look at those mixed strategies in a multiplayer game, and it's much less obvious what it means,
Makes
what the
sense.
counter exploit is, whose responsibility it is to exploit you. Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't think we have a great way of thinking about it just yet.
So we've got a couple of hands of yours to analyze. The first one, do you remember a blind on blind confrontation with Brewer where he had queen 10 of spades and you had ace 10 off?
Loosely, I don't remember the exact details, but yeah.
Excellent. We'll fire it up. So there's nobody super short here. You see Pedro and Faradine at 2.5, 2.4. Thomas has 2.8. Danny 3.1. Rodrigo folds a 5.1. And Chris is in the small blind with 4.6. Big blind 150. And you were chip leader with 6.4.
Yeah, yeah. So 30 big blinds deep.
So Chris completes, which brings me to my first question. What kind of strategy would you be playing in the small blind here? One of the larger remaining stacks, 30 big blinds going into the chip leader.
I would be playing very, very passively as the small blind here. I think you might not even be giving much up if you simplified it to all limps, but um, I would guess you get a few raises, but yeah, basically I'd be playing a very kind of cautious pot control, very heavy limp kind of strategy here.
So Chris does limp the queen 10 suited, and That gives you a decision here with the ace 10-0.
Yeah.
Any concern of getting shoved on here for 30 bigs?
Oh, absolutely. Getting shoved on here would be very painful. My instinct is you can't quite fold it. Like, this hand crushes the bluffs. Like, the limp jams are going to be bad aces. And yeah, I don't think you can raise fold this hand, but I'm not happy about it if I get jammed on. If I had, ace jack, I would be pretty happy about getting jammed on. I mean, not quite happy about it, but like I would feel like it was a super clear call.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas this, my instinct is to call if I get jammed on, and I imagine that was what I intended to do in game. And I would not be surprised if you put this in HRC or whatever, and it says that calling is incorrect. And I don't expect it to be worth a lot in any case.
Well, Chris does have a call.
Yeah.
Any option there? Could that ever be something in the check or the limp jam range?
I wouldn't be completely shocked, but it doesn't feel like it to me, no.
Sure. If it does, maybe that would mean ace 10-0 is not in the call.
I don't know which direction that would push me to get the hint that you're allowed to limp jam queen 10 suited there.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Go either direction. Chris checks, and you opt for, is that a little under half pot, 42%? Was it a little under 40% maybe?
Yeah, it looks like 40%.
Yeah, Chris calls. Ever check there? What are your thoughts with the
Oh
flop
yeah,
C bet?
it does not feel like the best hand to be c-betting with, and I don't think it's a pure bet board. So yeah, I don't think I'm betting 100% with my range or anything close to it.
Mhm.
I think that is a kind of favorable board for his, or decent anyway, for his limp call range, and I have a lot of junk that just has no equity there. So I don't think I'm anywhere
Mhm.
close to automatically c-betting, and I don't see any reason this would be one of the pure bet hands. If anything, I think it would be one of the lower frequencies to bet. Um, yeah, I think check would be fine. I imagine I explicitly randomized in game and rolled pretty high to end up betting.
One of the things I think a lot of players struggle with is ISOing enough in the big blind, particularly when they have some leverage on their opponent. And it doesn't take much poker theory to look at a chart and see how many junk hands ISO a limp. But I think it's the fear of how am I going to play post flop that keeps a lot of people from doing it. What does it look like on a board like this if you did ISO two cards, six and below, as far as your ability to put pressure on Chris on the flop or subsequent streets? Is there any three barreling you think with a 4-2-0 with a spade should another spade come, or do you need more equity than that to take your junk and apply pressure?
I would guess you almost certainly are allowed to bet your very worst hands on the flop sometimes here. If anything, your very worst hands might have a bit of a premium to bet relative to, say, something like King 7 or something like that, that is realizing a decent amount of equity checking. Um, but yeah, I think you start off betting right away with two unders reasonably often, and on at least some runouts will continue with them. Yeah, I think maybe on a lot of turns you're gonna need a little bit of a piece to keep betting, but maybe not. Yeah, I think you have to. I think you end up playing a kind of polar strat on turn river somewhat often and putting a bunch of money in with real nonsense.
Mm-hmm. I feel like it's something I can't think of too many hands that I've seen where someone in your situation here has red 3-2, ISO, C bet, turn, offsuit 4, barrel, river, offsuit 4. all in. Like it strikes me as a line that might just be fine, and I can't remember seeing that all that often at all.
Right, yeah, those plays feel really bad when you make them, and even worse when you make them and look it up later and are wrong.
I had
They
one of
can
those.
be very hard to pull the trigger on. I'm not sure you do want to bet the turn with complete nothing, uh, in that particular spot. Like if the turn is a 4, maybe even having as little as 5-6 is enough to keep betting, but actual 2 unders, no spade is just a bit too far.
Hmm.
That can be tricky to identify which spots you need a little piece to keep betting and which you use actual complete air. Yeah, it's just a difficult type of decision. There are certain spots where it's pretty obvious that you're going to need to bluff with complete nothing, and others where it is hard to know.
One area where I'm very envious of people with a nitty reputation, and I do everything I can to push students of mine who at least appear to be the nitty archetype, is that spot where you have a pretty wet board
Hmm.
and you should have a lot of light ISOs that you probably don't get credit for if you're a nit. And
Hmm.
so when the board completers come in, you just get put on no bluffs and people fold super high up in their range. And I feel like there's a lot of people who could take two unders on this board and print for the next year, just kind of like
Oh,
barreling
for
off,
sure. Yeah,
especially.
if you have a reputation as being too tight for that kind of thing, and people are overfolding a bit to you, you can really go hard and get away with it. I think that's true for sure.
So we get the offsuit king on the turn.
Yep.
Doesn't look like the kind of card Chris is going to lead at all. He goes for check, as do you. And congrats, you made two pair.
Yep.
Chris checks the river. Let's hear about your decision here.
Yeah, I felt like this was already somewhat close. Um, I don't think he can have very much better two pair. Like maybe he can have ace jack off as a limp call. I'm not even sure about that. Or maybe only ace jack suited and ace jack off shoves. That's also plausible. Those hands might be pretty likely to raise the flop if even if he has them. Doesn't feel likely that he has sets other than 8-8, which are likely to raise the flop. So I do think I'm very rarely beat by anything other than a straight. Of course, he's going to have a straight a lot to reach the river anyway. It's a second question how often he's going to check it. Um, but I could see that being reasonably often as well. Whereas I think he has a lot of king jack, king 10, jack 10. Jack 10 might raise the flop an awful lot. He's going to have king jack and king 10 here quite a bit, I would think. He's going to have, I think, a reasonable amount of ace 8 and ace 9 and ace high spades, king high spades, king 9. Like, I think I have, you know, before we start thinking about how his check modifies his range, it's hard for me to imagine I have less than like 80% equity on the river here. Maybe that's a
Mm-hmm.
little high, less than 75. Not probably 80. Yeah, I think my hand is somewhat clearly strong enough to bet, but maybe the exact bottom. I think that's around where I ended up in game. Maybe ace 8 bets as well. It felt thin, but like checking was not a very serious consideration. If
Mm-hmm.
I'm remembering how I was thinking about the spot at the time. And looking at it now, I'm not ultra confident that's correct. I don't think I have tried to look this hand up since playing it. I could even be kind of far off on that guess. Like, I mean, even starting from preflop, I was not super confident about the specifics of how this spot works. So there are a lot of places in this hand where I might have one or more assumptions wrong. When I was talking earlier in the show about the kind of spot that seems worth looking into further, this seems like one of those. Like, I have broad questions at multiple points in the hand about how things are supposed to work. I'm not super confident about
Mhm.
a variety of
Yeah.
things.
One of the things that emerges for me quickly is I don't think this is correct, but instinctually in Chris's spot, I might have played close to no bets on the river. I might have thought outside of, let's say, 5, 6 of spades, that my lowest showdown value hands, like 8, 9 of diamonds, just win too much. And I'd be like, I don't know, I just has trash here a lot that I don't know that I would have found the bluffs, and might have just tried to kind of balance that philosophy and say, yeah, I don't even know that I'm value betting at many hands if I take something like queen 10 or, even queen no pair, queen 6 of diamonds or something. And I mean, I guess I don't even know if queen 6 of diamonds check calls
I
flop,
think that
but
probably folds flop, but maybe probably clubs continues. Certainly spades
yeah,
continues.
yeah, I would, I mean, that seems to make some sense to put in a block maybe. But I don't know if I would have in game. I feel like I would have played such a heavy check, which starts, if someone's playing that strategy, then your ace 10 gets real close to the line. But um, just going back to the broad questions that you have, it feels like I'm pretty theoretically flawed here in Chris's spot, at least, which should
My
then
instinct
confuse me about
is
yours.
that, yeah, if you have 10-9 or worse here, your hand is not worth a whole lot checking, and you can consider bluffing those hands. Certainly an 8, I think you can consider bluffing. Like, my ISO range has so much big little in it that I'm just gonna have one pair of jacks, kings, or aces here an awful lot, and
Mhm.
I would think OOP can try to block for probably quite a small size, at most quarter pot here with maybe even as little as any 2 pair, or like jack 10 anyway. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I would think OOP has quite a few bets here, and I could be way off on that as well. This is a hard spot. It is hard to visualize both ranges, and there are a bunch of decisions in the hand here where I'm not super confident exactly what's going on. But yeah, I would think OOP gets quite a bit of betting here.
Makes sense. So you do eventually go for bet 1.9 in the middle, and that is what, 950
Yeah, I went for
half
half
pot.
pot.
And you see what you don't want to see. Chris goes for a small raise.
Yeah,
Talk about what makes a good bluff in Chris's spot here.
yeah. Let's see. I mean, I wouldn't want to use an ace for this, I don't think. Just because the one straight combo I'm certainly not checking the turn with is ace queen, so your ace doesn't block any of my straights.
Mhm.
Whereas if you have any of the other pairs, um, king, queen, queen, jack, queen 10, queen 8 are all reasonable value combos for me. Um,
How about in that case something like a king 4, king 5 suited? Block some queen
um,
low. Are you betting those a lot on the turn?
Yeah, I think those are fine. My immediate intuition is that there are not going to be real superstar bluff combos
Mhm.
here, and that it is a plausible enough play to bluff with more or less anything you get here with. At least from that perspective. The other thing is I don't know how much, just like how much you get to bluff here at all. Um like if I'm just using half pot as my size with straights or other value bets, like there's a certain point at which my ratio of straights to other value bets is high enough that that bluffing is just not a thing, that like you would have bet in the first place with hands that don't beat a bluff, and now you just don't gain anything relative to you don't gain enough relative to calling by raising them. Um, I guess that's not quite the case, but you might just want to use like literal min raise as your size here because it's getting kind of close to being the case. This is a tough one as well. Like, man, I just have a lot of random queen X relative to, my other value is pretty much exactly ace 10, ace jack, ace king, maybe ace 8. Um, maybe set of aces if I checked the turn with aces, which seems like it's a conceivable play. Yeah, an awfully large share of my value range might just be a straight, and
Mhm.
that makes raising difficult. But if you min raise, you're risking only 2/3 pot, uh, risking quarter pot beyond the call. So yeah, I guess I have enough value that is not a straight that you get a few bluffs. That seems right. I would be tempted to size really small though.
Makes sense.
There's probably some real nitty gritty blocker effects in terms of the exact hands you want to use, but it's probably a very small effect, would be my guess.
Makes sense. All right. As always, our final question is looking for three recommendations of any kind: book, movie, music, life tip, anything you got. A restaurant in a random city. I know you're a foodie. In terms of, we never talked about your cooking. If there's a dish people should make, anything you got.
All right, here's a dish I made last night that I love. It is among the easiest things in the world. Great way to use some good tomatoes if you can get your hands on some good fresh tomatoes while it's summertime. I think I've heard this. I think it's called. I This is based on a recipe I got from Serious Eats, which is a great website. There's the sub recommendation here. You want to learn how to make any dish, you can just Google Serious Eats name of the dish. There's virtually always a great recipe on that website. This is one I had not heard of before I found it there. Spaghetti alla cartieri. It is, you get some good fresh tomatoes, grate them into a bowl using like a box grater. Add garlic, olive oil, fresh basil, salt and pepper, and just cook some pasta, throw it into that, mix it up, and as long as you're starting with good fresh tomatoes, that is a delicious pasta. You can add some breadcrumbs to give it a little more texture. Uh, Wonderful dish. Good
Excellent.
light
You'll get a
summertime
picture when I make
pasta.
it.
I eat
Nice.
a lot of pasta at home. I'm a big fan of pasta. Other recommendations. Uh, Best TV show I've seen in a while, last several years. Why is the name of it going out of my head as soon as I've said this? This is
What's the
embarrassing.
plot?
I it's, um kind of a dystopian sci-fi workplace comedy sort of thing,
Hmm.
about Severance, yeah. The
So,
premise is, they've invented this procedure where they sever your identity so that you are two completely different people at work and at home, and you
huh,
don't remember anything that happens in the other one. When you're at work, you don't know who you are outside of the office. When you're at home, you don't know anything about what you do at work.
that's
Um,
great.
and it was really, really good. There's been one season so far. I think a second has been in the works for a while and is coming soon. It's like 10-30 minute episodes. It's not a huge time investment. Really good.
All right, I'm trying the first episode tonight.
Um, and all right, favorite book I've read recently, one of them anyway. Uh, Debt: The First 5,000 Years by David Graeber. It's,
What's about?
it is about, it's like a anthropological history of the concept of debt, of how humans have conceived of owing things to each other, not exclusively money,
Hmm.
and how that has shaped history and how we think about the world and our relations to each other. And really, yeah, mind blowing book. Changed how I think about things. It is very interesting how the concept of owing something to somebody else functions in the world.
Nick and I were just talking the other day. We hate when someone does us a favor. It's just this brutal feeling of debt hanging over your head. Like, avoid it at all costs.
That is covered in a lot of detail and from a lot of interesting perspectives in this book.
Excellent. I'm
And
interested.
how that can actually function to increase bonds between people. That, um you know, the clearing of debts, making sure that, we don't owe each other anything, can be an act of hostility. That, like, you know, friends alternate paying the bill at lunch instead
Mhm.
of splitting it, because splitting it is, in some ways, communicating, I'm not sure I'm ever going to see you again, and I don't want to owe you anything. Let's make sure
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this rings true to me.
there's a
I'm always a
balance.
little bit bothered when I'm out with my girlfriend's friends, like they're Venmoing each other, and I'm just like, can we just like, we'll pay, and next time you'll pay, and can we not do this? But I mean,
Yeah,
obviously, it's hyper logical, but there is some undercurrent of that. Like there's that beautiful bond of whatever. We don't have to keep a ledger. It'll even out.
yeah. And the ways different cultures have dealt with that at different times is pretty interesting.
That's cool. I'm gonna check it out.
Yeah,
Ike Haxton, thank you for joining me.
it's been a pleasure.